Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dan Terris. I am the director of the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life here at Brandeis University, and also the chair of the committee that helped plan the centennial series for the series of events to mark the Louis Brandeis centennial. I'm filling in as an introducer today for Heller School Dean Marty Krauss, so I'm doing double duty as introducer and also as the moderator for today's panel. On January 28, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson announced the nomination of a well-known Boston lawyer named Louis D. Brandeis to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court that had opened after the sudden death of Justice Joseph Lamar. The appointment of Brandeis, who had no judicial experience but had a national reputation for his willingness to take on establishment interests, brought shock and consternation in many circles, though cheers in others, among those in the American Jewish community, since Brandeis was the first Jewish American to be nominated for the nation's highest court. A lengthy and contentious 4-month confirmation process ensued, which ended on June 1st, 1916, when the Senate confirmed him by a vote of 47 to 22. Now, I'll note that that nomination and confirmation fight did indeed take place during a presidential election year. And no one, as that I recall, although maybe Jeff Rosen can correct me, no one in that year questioned the president's right to make the appointment or the Senate's duty to consider it. Though, and it's much too long a story to enter into here, election year politics did figure, indeed, prominently in the confirmation fight. And if you're interested in more of that, you can see David Dowlin's paper on the website for the Louis Brandeis series, or indeed read Jeff Rosen's forthcoming biography for more details about that incredibly interesting confirmation fight over the course of 4 months in 1916. Here at Brandeis University, we're marking the centennial of our namesake's elevation to the country's highest court with a series of events. On January 28, 2016, 100 years to the day after the nomination, many of you, I'm sure, were down at the Gosman Athletic Center for a program on Louis D. Brandeis, the Supreme Court and American Democracy, which featured Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who spoke to 3,000 members of our community on lessons from Louis Brandeis. She was joined then by a distinguished panel, including judges Ralph Gantz and Mark Wolf, and authors Jeffrey Toobin and Philippa Strum. Last week, we continued the series with an excellent program in this room, hosted by the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies on Louis Brandeis and Zionism. And 3 more panel discussions, which you'll find listed in your printed materials, will follow this event, along with another dozen or so events and exhibitions mounted by students, faculty, and staff throughout our university community. Today, our series continues with a program on citizenship and the economy, labor, inequality, and bigness, or as I've taken to shortening it, when Bernie met Louis. And contrary to some of the signs around campus, those of you who came expecting Senator Sanders to show up in person, let's just say that our advertising is really no more false than a lot of other things that you've been hearing during the presidential election year. Louis Brandeis had a complicated relationship with the world of business and American capitalism. He was a successful lawyer in Boston, building his reputation as an attorney for many of New England's most prominent concerns. Yet he became nationally famous in the first decades of the 20th century as a crusader against the perils of what he called the curse of bigness, the tendency of corporate concerns to grow large enough to squelch competition, small-scale enterprise, and the concerns of their workers. Today, we'll be exploring Louis Brandeis' thought and actions in our discussion, but in the spirit of the title of this series, Louis D. Brandeis, Then and Now, we will also be exploring the continuing resonance of his ideas in our own era. In our own 2016 presidential election year, the issues of Wall Street chicanery, massive inequality, and the corrupting influence of the concentration of wealth on American society and politics, those ideas are very much alive again, most prominently perhaps in the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, but also echoing in different ways through the populist tenor in both major parties. These issues are but one instance among many explored over the course of the semester that testify to the oversized influence that Louis Brandeis had and continues to have on the shape of American life. We have an outstanding panel today to discuss these issues, but before I turn to the format and the introduction of our panelists, just a few acknowledgments and thanks. First, I'm very pleased to welcome to our program today Louisa Popkin, the great-granddaughter of Louis Brandeis. Please. And we can perhaps count on her for inside perspective. And by the way, I commend to all of you the fantastic exhibit downstairs in the university archives on Justice Brandeis, which has a lot of family photographs as well as professional artifacts. I'm also happy to welcome to today's program Professor Dan Breen and the students in American Studies 188B, Louis Brandeis, Law, Business, and Politics. So we know that we can count on some highly informed questions from Brandeis undergraduates as part of our conversation, and also the students in the Supreme Court colloquium taught by Professor Paul Herron. Welcome to all of you who are showing particular interest in the topics of Justice Brandeis and the court on which he serves. I'm also very grateful to the members of the Louis Brandeis Centennial Celebration Committee. They are too numerous to mention, but their names are all listed on your program, so I urge you to turn to that page and silently thank each and every one of them, as I have done many times, for their incredible work in bringing this whole series to fruition. And finally, I'd like to thank my colleague David Weinstein from the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life, who has really helped coordinate a great many of these events and today's program in particular. So I am now going to move into my moderating role and move here. Thank you. And I will not introduce the moderator at any great length. But I will say this, the Then and Now series is designed to bring a mixture of scholars, journalists, legal professionals, and other social and political actors for an exchange of views. The idea was from the beginning that we wanted people not just from the academy, but outside as well. We wanted to explore Louis Brandeis's life and work and thought and actions, but also how they play out today. And so the Then and Now is very much part of this. And one of the things we also wanted to do was to create a lasting legacy for the program. So most of our panelists have contributed original essays, which are posted online. If you've read the ones by the panelists today that are on our website, congratulations. You're ahead of the game. You'll be all the more prepared to engage in the conversation. And if you haven't read them yet, please take your programs with you. Check them out online. You'll be able to hear some of what they have to say, but in greater depth and elaboration. They're really fantastic essays, and there are 8 or 10 more from the panelists who are coming in the coming weeks, and they're all already up there. So read to your heart's content. So for today, our panelists are not going to give long presentations based on their papers. Instead, they're going to introduce some of their thinking at the beginning, and our format will be mostly conversational. I'll ask each of them a question to get started that allow them to draw on their written work and open up some avenues. And then I'll turn to Betsy Brainerd, the Brandeis faculty member, for some of her thoughts about some of the thinking that our panelists have shared with us. And then we'll have a little conversation for a while and then open it up for questions and comments from all of you. Full biographies are available in the very thick program that you have that covers the whole semester. So I won't read an extensive biography of the panelists' credentials, but let me identify each of them now so you can match the names to the faces and you can welcome them properly. To my immediate left is Jeffrey Rosen. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, professor of law at the George Washington University and contributing editor for The Atlantic, the author of a number of well-known books on law, including The Supreme Court, The Personalities and Rivalries That Defined America, but most relevant to our program and very exciting for us, he is the author of Louis Brandeis, American Prophet, a forthcoming new biography of Louis Brandeis in Yale University Press's Jewish Life Live series, and I anticipate that we'll be getting an advanced look at some of Jeff Rosen's thinking about Louis Brandeis in his work, in that work today. To his left, Richard Adelstein, the Woodhouse Cisco Professor of Economics at Wesleyan University. In the multidisciplinary spirit of Louis Brandeis and this university, he's a lawyer and a scholar whose work crosses disciplines freely at the intersection of law, economics, history, and philosophy. He's tackled Louis Brandeis many times before, notably in his monograph on the rise of planning in industrial America, and his original essay for the Louis Brandeis Then and Now series is called The Last Autonomist. To his left, Alexis Goldstein, who has been on both sides of the wall of Wall Street. She worked for many years in technology positions in some of Wall Street's biggest firms, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and Deutsche Bank, or as it says on her online bio, puts it, before Alexis occupied Wall Street occupied Alexis. Then she turned her talents to the Occupy movement, and among other things, she was the co-author of Occupy the SAC's 325-page comment letter to the financial regulators, urging them towards a strong Volcker rule. She's no longer formally with Occupy, but if you want to follow her work, you can catch one of her 3 co-hosted podcast series, Humorless Queers, a monthly podcast covering Wall Street and mass surveillance, this is from her own website, in a way that doesn't make you want to die. Criticize After Dinner, which reviews Hollywood movies through a radical leftist lens, and Disorderly Conduct, a finance and economic podcast. So you have plenty of chances to follow up Alexis following today's program. And finally, to her left, our Brandeis University commentator today is Elizabeth Brainerd. Betsy Brainerd is the Susan and Barton Whitaker Professor in Economics and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis University. Her research focuses on labor and health economics with a particular interest in understanding the social and health consequences of the transition to capitalism in formerly socialist countries. I don't know how many podcasts Betsy Brainerd has, but you'll have to ask her about that at a different time. All right, so let's get started. I want to start with you, Jeff Rosen. Louis Brandeis, famous, and I think a lot of students and others in our community will recognize the phrases of the curse of bigness, will know that he wrote a book called Other People's Money, and that he took on some of the large interests in this country. Help us get past those headlines and set Louis Brandeis in the context of his era and help give us the background we need to understand his relationship with the world of business and money.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here and such a thrill to be here at the shrine of my hero, Louis Brandeis. I feel like I've gone to Brandeisian heaven. I'm wearing the pin. I've seen his robes. I see the Warhol portrait. And I have an advanced copy of this riveting new book, Louis D. Brandeis, American Prophet, which will be published on June 1st, the actual 100th anniversary of his confirmation hearings.
And we can place advance orders now
you
online?
You can indeed. Amazon is waiting, as is my publisher. Right, we want to ensure that this book really suffers from the curse of bigness, so order it right now. This book argues that Louis Brandeis was the greatest critic of bigness in business and government since the author of the Declaration of Independence. Basically, that he was the Jewish Jefferson. You mentioned that this is a panel about when Bernie meets Wall Street, but I think that's not quite right. It was interesting that Bernie Sanders, when he was attacking size and the banks, attributed the attack on size to Theodore Roosevelt, of all people. But in fact, it was Brandeis and Wilson in the election of 1912 who insisted on breaking up the banks so they were small enough to impose a tax on size. Theirs was the new freedom. Roosevelt's new nationalism, by contrast, wanted to have regulatory bodies that were large enough to regulate the banks. Brandeis opposed that because he opposed bigness in government as well as bigness. And then the third candidate, William Howard Taft, wanted a law enforcement model to prosecute the banks using the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was Brandeis's vision, channeling Jefferson, that has the most to teach us about our contemporary vexations, about corporate size, as well as privacy and technology. And I want to just give a sense of how profoundly Jeffersonian he was, because we think of him in many guises today as a progressive, as an advocate of judicial restraint, but we forget the fact that he self-identified as a Jeffersonian. His favorite book was Alfred Knox, biography of Jefferson, which called Jefferson the great libertarian and described how Jefferson, like Brandeis, saw American history as a battle between productive producers, small farmers, and agrarian workers, and monopolists, and oligarchs, and financiers. The radicalism of Jefferson comes through in Knox's biography, which recalls that Jefferson supported an amendment to the Constitution, which ultimately failed, that would have prohibited Congress from setting up corporations with exclusive privileges. Jefferson, like Brandeis, were not foes of capitalism, they were foes of monopoly. And that's why Jefferson insisted that businesses and governments be organized in the smallest scale possible so as to avoid the dangers of unproductive monopolists. The monopolists of Jefferson's day were the hated Bank of the United States, which was upheld by his arch rival, Chief Justice Marshall, over objections from Jefferson and Madison. By contrast, for Brandeis, the villain was J.P. Morgan, the oligarch who controlled great swaths of the American economy because of his control over what Brandeis unforgettably called other people's money. When Morgan died, Rockefeller announced to think he wasn't even a rich man because he had less money than Rockefeller, but Rockefeller misunderstood the sources of Morgan's power, which Brandeis grasped, which was his ability to leverage the capital, the quick capital of others, to make risky investments in complicated instruments whose value Morgan and others couldn't possibly understand. Brandeis thought that this violated the fundamental law of human limitations, which was that organizations that were too large were too complicated for any individual fully to grasp, and this is why he insisted on one job only. He always urged his clerks and everyone that he could encounter to go back to their hometowns. He was crushed when he found that one young man had grown up in Manhattan, and he advised another journalist who asked for advice to go back to Oregon. Brandeis's concern about the curse of Bigness, which he expressed in the unforgettable 1913 book, which coined that phrase, led him to predict the crash of 1929. He basically, in 1926, said, I have to record my inability to understand why folks just don't go broke. And he always insisted on, he viewed the stock market as a form of legalized gambling, always insisted on safe bonds. That was why when he died, he had $3 million, a figure which discomfited some of his progressive acolytes. This is hundreds of millions of dollars in 2016 money, but that's because he spent only 10% of his income on living expenses. He wanted to provide for his family, his wife, and his daughters, to whom he was devoted, while devoting the rest of his income to public service on the public's behalf. Other people's money came up with a series of proposals for remedies to the curse of Bigness, and several of these were adopted after the crash of '29, most notably the Glass-Steagall Act, which was explicitly inspired by Brandeis and insisted on the separation of commercial from investment banking. Brandeis opposed many of the regulatory responses of the first New Deal, which breathed the spirit, according to Arthur Schlesinger, of Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism. He thought that institutions like the National Industrial Recovery Act were too centralizing. Remember, he opposed Bigness in government as well as business. That's why he would not have been a fan of some of Bernie Sanders' proposals to expand the size of government. He warned Franklin Roosevelt in his prophetic mode. He summoned Roosevelt's advisors to his chambers and said, you have to tell the president we have to stop this business of centralization. It's going to end. And then the prophet made good on his threat, and on Black Monday, he joined a unanimous court in striking down the most centralizing elements of the first New Deal. Roosevelt's acolytes learned this lesson, and the second New Deal breathed the spirit of Brandeis and Wilson, and things like the Robinson-Patman Act and others did begin to attempt to regulate corporate size. But in the 1990s, the aptly named Commodity Futures Trading Act, which is now under dispute in the presidential debates, dismantled the separation between commercial and investment banking that had prevailed until then, and contributed to the crash of 2008. Brandeis would have not been surprised, and indeed would have seen this as a vindication of his fears about the dangers of complicated derivatives whose values people can't actually understand because of their complexity and size. I'm much looking forward to our discussion of the responses to the crash of 2008. The Dodd-Frank Act, I think, would have given Brandeis only one satisfaction. It was much more Hamiltonian than Jeffersonian, again, in creating new large regulatory bodies to wind up troubled banks, although he would have approved of the increased capitalization requirements, which have doubled the capitalization of the banks since Dodd-Frank Act. But he would have been distressed by the failure of bills like that proposed by Senators Kaufman and Vitter, which we're going to hear more about later, which would have required banks to have only 10% of their equity tied up. So in the end, the Brandeisian vision has no strong political constituencies in Congress, but, and I'll close here, I think it does offer a thrillingly bipartisan vision for our polarized age. Today we see Tea Party libertarians and conservatives like Senator Vitter and social welfare state progressives from Senator Sanders to Senator Clinton, who actually is beginning to question some of the dangers of reckless bank action, all united by concerns about size. And of course, we also see Brandeis's prescient thoughts about privacy and technology and the need to translate those values in light of new technologies being embraced by people from the civil libertarian left to the libertarian right. So my hope, my passion, my mission in life is to ensure that this great American prophet's hour has come round at last. I think there's no one who has more to teach us about the dangers of corporate governmental bigness and the need to translate the Constitution in light of privacy and technology. And I just want to end, as I always do, to inspire myself by Brandeis's notion that although the task ahead is challenging, if we would govern by the light of reason, we must let our minds be bold. Thank you so much.
Great.
Very good.
Hear, hear. You may be preaching to the converted in this hall, but it's quite a sermon.
We will convert the world.
Exactly. Richie Adelstein, you call Louis Brandeis the last autonomist. Tell us what you mean by that and about the distinction between fighting monopoly and fighting bigness in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Thanks. Let me join Jeffrey and say that this is quite an honor for me. Brandeis is my hero as well. I'm not uncritical of him, but I certainly do miss him, and I wish that we had him with us today. Brandeis is famous as being the greatest opponent of bigness. In many audiences, I have to stop now and tell people what bigness is, but I don't think I need to do that here. He was the greatest opponent of bigness, but he was certainly not the first opponent of bigness. And his relations, intellectual and political relations with his natural allies during the period between 1890 and 1911 seem to me to be very problematic and very interesting. Most people forget that in the last 30 years of the 19th century, America was a developing country. At the end of the Civil War, it was still what we now understand underdeveloped countries to be, agrarian, dispersed, and generally dominated by traditions rather than by modernism. And in the United States, of course, tradition meant Jefferson and Tocqueville and such things. Then after the Civil War comes mass production and the Second Industrial Revolution. Within the space of 30 years, between 1870 and 1900, America is transformed from an agricultural nation into the largest industrial power in the world, and its economy is already in 1900 dominated by a range of large corporations which continued to dominate the American economy all the way through 1970. So all of this happened very, very rapidly in the United States, and people were perplexed and confused about it. It had not happened anywhere else with enough time for anybody to take any notice of it and to think about it. And so during this period, 1870 to 1910, Americans openly debated what the 20th century was going to be like, what the response of the country to this new modernization was going to be. And as with most developing countries, people split ultimately into what might be thought of as two parties with respect to the modern industrialization. The victorious party, whom I call the Friends of Efficiency, wanted the United States that we all live in. And so it's not really very difficult to describe their position. Their position was that Bigness was good because Bigness was efficient, it was modern, and it produced enormous, enormous amounts of material wealth, and that people would be benefited by this material wealth, for the Friends of Efficiency went without saying. But as in every developing country, there was an opposition to modernization, and it was rooted in traditionalism, and again, American traditionalism is Jefferson and Tocqueville, and Brandeis falls decidedly into this camp. Certainly when we look back, we see him in this alternative, lost cause, smallness party, which I call the autonomists. For 30 years, between 1880 and 1910, there were a group of dedicated autonomists, two of them on the Supreme Court of the United States. One of them ran for president 3 times, and they put this question in front of the American people. Do we want to surrender to bigness and get rich, or will we eschew bigness and eschew the wealth that goes with it, so that we can maintain the great American culture, what Brandeis thought of as the great American experiment in decentralized political and economic power and in the assumption of personal responsibility. The autonomists, other than Brandeis, understood a fundamental truth about bigness, and that is that bigness produced enormous amounts of wealth. And they understood the obverse of that, and that is that you can't have that much material wealth unless you have large-scale industrial production. And so, in the context of the Sherman Act, John Marshall Harlan I and the infamous Rufus W. Peckham fought the good fight for autonomy in trying to get the court to interpret the Sherman Act in such a way as to make it an anti-bigness act, and to take the position through the Sherman Act that Brandeis ultimately came to urge on everybody, which was to use the force of government to break up large-scale firms and effectively enforce smallness against the will of the people, whose purchases and desire for material wealth were precisely what was making the firms very big. The autonomists understood that you had to trade wealth for smallness. And so one would have expected that Brandeis would have been on their side during the critical moment when Harlan and Peckham and William Jennings Bryan were in fact fighting the political fight for bigness, against bigness. But in fact, Brandeis was not. And during this period, rather surprisingly, he came out very strongly for 2 policies: the adoption of the rule of reason into the Sherman Act, and to allow firms to grow as large as markets would allow them to grow. Both of these positions were strongly endorsed by Brandeis, and they were the keystone positions of the Friends of Efficiency. The Friends of Efficiency did not want to see the rule of reason abandoned. The rule of reason was not hostile to bigness, it was hostile to monopoly. And if a firm did not monopolize, the rule of reason allowed it to grow as large as markets would allow it to grow. The autonomists on the court were strongly opposed to this interpretation, but in 1911, Brandeis showed his cards by coming out strongly in favor of the rule of reason. And in 1912, he wrote a wonderful piece in which he anticipated the modern theory of how firms get large in markets and what the forces are which drive them. He didn't join the autonomists because he didn't believe their claim that you had to trade wealth for smallness. Brandeis felt that you didn't have to make this trade because if you allowed firms to grow as large as efficiency would allow them to grow, they would only grow to be of moderate to small size, because Brandeis was presciently able to anticipate what we now call the economics of bounded rationality. He understood, as Jeffrey alludes to, that people are of very limited mental, cognitive capacity, There's a sign outside the library, a quotation from Brandeis that says that organization cannot substitute for personal judgment, which he certainly did say. And indeed, he felt that as a result of this, in his famous quotation from Goethe that the care is taken that the trees don't scrape the skies, he felt that human limitations, particularly of executives, would provide a limit to how large firms would grow. And so he thought, if you simply allowed markets to be cleansed by enforcing a rule of reason, then firms would be limited in their growth by the limits of human cognition and the limits of human administration. Well, as it turned out, he was wrong about this. He pushed the logic of bounded rationality much too far. I don't think he appreciated the strengths of modern organization and the way in which modern organization can overcome some of the limitations of the human mind and of human scale. And Brandeis did not understand scale economies, and so he did not understand what it was that made big firms as efficient as they were and why they produced as much wealth as they did. But slowly, especially after his appointment to the Supreme Court, Brandeis came to realize the mistake, the intellectual mistake that he had made, and he began to understand that the earlier autonomists had been right. And there was indeed a choice to be made between bigness and wealth on the one hand, and autonomy, responsibility, smallness on the other hand, and that the way that American capitalism was set up, it was up to consumers, to people, acting one at a time in markets to make the decision as to how large firms would grow. And this is the freedom that people had in the early part of the 20th century, and they used it to buy cheap goods and to produce the enormous corporations that dominated the economy in the 20th century and which Brandeis hated. In the 20s, Brandeis came to realize that this is what had caused the firms to grow large. It was the behavior of those same little people to whom he had devoted his life and whom he felt would be the beneficiaries of smallness if only they would have the self-discipline to undertake it. But he realized that they didn't have the self-discipline to undertake it. He was extremely disappointed at the choice for bigness that his people had made, and it gave new poignancy to his famous quotation that Americans were a people who hated monopoly, but in fact loved business. I think that when Brandeis realized this about the American people and experienced this disappointment with them, that this was a turning point in his attitude toward Palestine and Zionism. When one reads his writing about Palestine, Brandeis's writing about Palestine, he idealizes the young people in particular who live on kibbutzim. He thought these people were what Americans should have been like, were supposed to have been like. These were people who were willing to accept poverty, who were willing to accept material deprivation so that they could live the life of the kibbutz, so that they could live the life of self-control, they could live the life of smallness, they could live the life of how shall we put it, Brandeisian libertarianism. Whether such people actually exist or not anywhere in the world is an open question, but I do think that Brandeis's attitudes toward Zionism and toward Palestine and Israel, what would become Israel, were colored in some large part by his disappointment with the people to whom he had devoted himself in the United States. I'll close with just one short comment. Dan asked us to say what Brandeis might say about America if he were here today. Don't get me started, but he would not be a happy camper looking around at America today. And this will be the last thing I say, I promise, but he would take great, great heart in the climate change movement. He would, because of his commitment to science and his commitment to experimentation. He would be the last person to deny the reality of climate change. He would be on the forefront fighting the good fight, as only he could, for addressing the problem of climate change. But here's where he'd really come into his own. When we hear about climate change in the world today, we're told that unless we do something about the climate, it's the big casino for all of us, and that the planet is going to burn to a crisp. Those of us who are in the developed countries are being told that saving the planet will require all of us to use a great deal less of the material resources in the world and to accept somewhat, indeed a large, reduction in the standard of our living. Most people would see this as a catastrophe, and there's very, very little discussion in the politics, in the press, anywhere, very little discussion of what the world might look like if we were to make a serious address to climate change. It would be less wealthy. And Brandeis would say it could be smaller. And so it could well be that the climate crisis will provide the opportunity for Jeffrey and I to see Brandeis's ideas finally brought to fruition, first brought to prominence, and then, one might hope, brought to fruition in response to this crisis. Thanks.
Thank you, Richie. Alexis Goldstein, Jeff Rosen, and Richie Adelstein have helped kind of qualify our the sort of popular notion of Brandeis as a crusader against big business, pointing out that while he had his skepticisms about size, that he also was skeptical about some kinds of approaches to that, whether it was big national institutions or attacking monopoly. Bring us forward into the 21st century. Richie started bringing us there. Bring us forward to, you've spent a lot of your career thinking about the resonance of these same kinds of issues in our own time. Tell us about the resonance of Louis Brandeis for these issues today.
Well, thank you, and I join my fellow panelists in just saying what an honor it is to be here today. I certainly try to learn what I can from the legacy of Brandeis, and I am particularly interested in his ability to challenge the power of corporations to do what he called dominate the state. I think he's been one of the most successful crusaders against the power of large corporations. And as I'm sure you've heard in this election cycle and prior to that, the nation's biggest banks are larger now than they were prior to the financial crisis of 2008. So I think it's especially crucial that we be looking at ways to tackle this problem. And one thing I learned in the course of doing research for this panel is that Brandeis was a really strong believer in the power of disclosure, the famous quote about sunlight being the best disinfectant or electric light being the best policeman. And I'm going to differ slightly with Jeffrey on the legacy of the Dodd-Frank Act. So Dodd-Frank came about as a response to the financial crisis, and one of the pieces of this very large bill was the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren, who's someone who has been compared to Brandeis in a lot of ways. The fight that was kicked up over the confirmation fight of Brandeis, you had lots of moneyed interest-paying groups to run anti-Brandeis ads. Senator Elizabeth Warren has had a lot of moneyed groups paying to run anti-her and anti-CFPB ads in some of the election debates. I don't know if you've seen it, but there was one ad where there was like a big portrait of her, a big portrait of the head of the CFPB on a red banner. They were trying to imply that the whole bureau was, I guess, a communist model where people were just denying loan applications. But what the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau actually does is it tries to bring more transparency to the financial markets. They've returned over $11 billion to consumers who've been scammed by their financial companies. They have a consumer complaint database where you can go and you can log a complaint against any financial firm that rips you off, and it is public. So if you are interested in hearing about Bank of America's record on doing mortgages, you can go to consumerfinance.gov/complaint and look, and you can see the kinds of complaints that have been filed against them. So I see that as being very much in line with what Brandeis thought about in terms of the power of an informed consumer. And if only investors knew how much their broker was screwing them over, maybe they would act and do something different. In some ways, that's the idea behind some of the things that the CFPB does. But I'm very interested in the ways that he shined this big spotlight on the oligarchy, our financial oligarchy of his time, and I find it somewhat humorous that his chief nemesis, J.P. Morgan, is the largest American bank, I believe, today. In 2014, they had $2.6 trillion in assets, which is almost 15% of America's GDP as of 2014. They are essentially as big and as powerful as they were in his time. And so I'm so interested in what are some ways that power is exercised, and I want to give you one example, and then I want to look to Brandeis and just see maybe how can we try to fight against it. So setting aside JP Morgan for a second, he was their arch nemesis. They credited him. JP Morgan bankers blamed him for the passage of Glass-Steagall, which was mentioned previously. That was the Depression era law that separated the more boring commercial banking, your savings account, your checking account, from the casino-style banking. And I think, my belief is that after the passage of Glass-Steagall, we had decades of financial stability, and it was an important check on bigness. And now we see this in the debate, in the presidential debate. Is Glass-Steagall important or is it not? But actually, the death of Glass-Steagall did not happen in an instant. So Jeffrey mentioned the 1999 law, Graham, Leach, Bliley. I see that as the final nail in the coffin of Glass-Steagall. There were actually a lot of little cuts that came about before that, and they all happened in the shadows without a lot of public attention. By the same token, something happened just a couple years ago in the shadows that I think was especially problematic. In 2014, as a part of the government funding bill, they snuck a provision on that was language that was literally written by the bank Citigroup. The New York Times had found out that there was this language that they had written that, it's a bit complicated, but essentially they were, as a part of Dodd-Frank, required to take some of the riskiest derivatives and push it out into a separately capitalized part of the bank, so that this part of the bank that had your deposits in it wouldn't be affected if some of these crazy risky derivatives went out of control. As a part of the 2014 government funding bill, they basically took that away. And Elizabeth Warren took to the Senate floor and she said Citigroup 32 times on the Senate floor. And as somebody who used to work on Wall Street, they generally don't pay attention to Congress, but the only time they do is when a member of Congress is saying their name. And it's usually once or twice and everybody freaks out, let alone 32 times across, I think it was a single week that she said Citigroup, 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 Citigroup. But I think it speaks to the power of what Brandeis warned about, the power of large corporations to dominate the state, that Citigroup was able to get this legislation through, tacked onto a government funding bill, in spite of the fact that when you add up all of the government assistance that that bank received, it was about $500 billion altogether, along with all the other things that banks were culpable in the financial crisis, like predatory racist lending. The Department of Justice has found that lots of times these banks went into communities of color and gave them higher rates on their mortgage products than whites that had the same income levels, the same exact credit scores, just because of the color of their skin. So it is astonishing to me, and yet not surprising, that Washington continues to listen to these actors that got such big bailouts, that perpetuated such bad crimes, and yet they continue to pass their legislation. So what I'm always interested to know, and I feel like Brandeis is a good lesson in this, is how do we fight it? And I feel like there are a number of members of Congress, not just Senator Warren, I don't want to just speak about her, Senator Brown is another good example, Senator Jeff Merkley, but it's the power of the spotlight and the power of kicking up a fight when these things happen. Because Glass-Steagall didn't just end in that moment in 1999. There were a bunch of decisions by a regulator that you've probably never heard of. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Office of the Comptroller for the Currency, or the OCC for short. Right. So they're an incredibly important regulator. Leading up to 1999, they made a lot of decisions to allow banks to start to be able to do lots of things with derivatives they previously were not allowed to do. And the lack of a spotlight, I think, is what allowed that kind of a thing to happen. So that's one of the main legacies, I think, that we can learn from Brandeis, is you need to kick up a fight. You need to write the series of essays that are then turned into other people's money. You need to wage the kind of rhetorical war that he waged, to the point that banks are going to be running ads against you when you get appointed or nominated to the Supreme Court. Now, my day job these days is I work at a nonpartisan coalition group called Americans for Financial Reform, and you might not be surprised to hear that we lose a lot. So we're sort of Wall Street's saying, let's come undo the rules, and we're saying, no, let's put some more rules in, and we lose a lot. But I was very encouraged when I was doing my research for this talk to learn that Brandeis's fight against the J.P. Morgan-controlled New Haven Railroad, it took him 9 years to win that. And he lost a lot of rounds before they finally won. And so just so that I don't end on a dour note, because I think some of this stuff may seem so unachievable, right? How do we break up the banks? How can we do something like that? Oh, before I end on my hopeful note, I just want to point out one other thing about Dodd-Frank. There's a lot of talk in the election. How do we break up the banks? What's the right size? Believe it or not, Dodd-Frank actually has a right size for banks. It's part of, this is super wonky, so I apologize, but it's called resolution planning. But it basically says if a bank cannot go bankrupt without government help, it is too big to fail. And the regulators have the power today to force them to start to split themselves up if they believe that they are too big to fail safely through bankruptcy without government help. So in a way, Dodd-Frank has given us and directed the regulators to break up the banks. They're just not doing it. So here's my hopeful note to end on. It took Brandeis 9 years to bust up New Haven Railroad. We're really less than 8 years out since the financial crisis and less than 6 years out since the passage of Dodd-Frank. So I do think that this election is an important moment where we can kick up a lot of noise, shine a big spotlight. I've never heard Glass-Steagall mentioned more outside of my own office in this election season than maybe since Occupy. People had a lot of signs that said Glass-Steagall during Occupy, but I'm very hopeful, and the legacy of Brandeis makes me very hopeful as well.
Thank you, Alexis, and thank you for helping perhaps elaborate and challenge a little Jeff Rosen's notion that Louis Brandeis has no constituencies in Congress. You've at least identified maybe one or two, including our Massachusetts' own senator.
I meant a majority.
Oh, you meant a majority.
Absolutely has
Okay.
constituents in Congress
Okay.
for the reasons that were very well expressed.
Good. Betsy Brainerd, what do you want to draw our attention to from what we've heard from our group?
Well, first, let me say thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And I really enjoyed reading your essays about Brandeis and his legacy. And I learned a lot from it. So I really appreciate all the effort that you put in to put those essays together. I just wanted to raise a couple of questions and maybe some possible themes for our panel of experts to kind of further explore a few themes that I thought came out in the essays that you haven't touched on very much, and I'm kind of curious about what Brandeis's thoughts would be on these themes. The first one is, how much concern did Brandeis have for any link between bigness and inequality? And I raise that question because, as I'm sure many of you know, inequality is one of the galvanizing issues in our country today, and wage inequality in the United States is the highest of any developed country. And obviously there's a lot of concern for the reasons behind that and for the causes, how it affects people's lives. And so I wonder if, and in fact, Richie, in your essay, it seemed to me that there was almost a link between consumers benefiting from, the bigness and from the lower prices that large corporations are able to provide, and inequality. And maybe I was reading too much into that, but I wonder if there's any sense that consumers themselves were part of this kind of unequal relationship. So that was the first question, is how much concern for inequality, and actually linked to that is there was a brief mention about the role of unions, and my understanding is that Brandeis felt that unions could play an important role as a counterweight to large corporations. And I wonder, in fact, is there some contradiction in that? Because unions then would be big if they were effective counterweights. And second, just any insight into the decline of unions today and how that has possibly increased the power of corporations. So that's kind of one broad area that we could possibly explore. The second, Dan actually raised this in some of our conversation prior to the panel getting together, which is the rise of contract labor and how that relates to the idea of autonomy. So as we all well know, in the US, we have an increase in the kind of autonomous labor, the rise of contract labor, of people who are able to kind of sell their services on a contract basis as Uber drivers or tutors or what have you. And in many ways, that fits the Brandeisian notion of the autonomous worker who are able to, have a lot of say in their employment and their work hours and have been able to design their own work as they want to. But on the other side of that, there's a lot of insecurity that goes along with it. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about how this would fit into the Brandeis's view of autonomy. And the third, I can't resist but quote Jeffrey Rosen about Brandeis's bipartisan vision for our polarized age. And that raises the question, which I'm sure many of you have thought about, is how much could a voice like his influence today's discourse? I think it's really compelling to think that there can be a vision that encompasses bigness, or opposing bigness, both in government and in the business world. And are there any political actors today with this kind of vision who have the potential to influence political discourse today? So those were my thoughts to raise.
Terrific.
Thank you.
Well, between what the three of you have already raised and the questions that Betsy's pulled together, we have we can take the entire rest of the semester and focus on them. Where shall we start? First, are there any comments or questions that you had for one another based on what you already heard, or shall we move to some of the questions that Betsy has raised?
I'm good.
I would just want to say one thing to what Richie mentioned about the sort of efficiency of large institutions, to point out that two of the beneficiaries of the death of Glass-Steagall, John Reed and Sandy Weil, who were executives at the Travelers and Citibank, which merged together, have both come back and said that the repeal of Glass-Steagall was a bad idea, that actually big banks aren't as efficient as we thought they were. So I was curious, had you seen those and what you thought about?
Right. That's a very good question, and I was not referring to banks. I'm referring to economies of scale in manufacturing, which is what was making firms large at the time. And I don't think that there's any doubt that mass production and the large scale that's required to organize mass production technology will produce more material wealth. How it gets divided, equally or unequally, who has their finger on it, who can control where it will go, these are all critically important questions. And I must say, I agree with the implication of your question 100%. There are no economies of scale in banking at all. And the sorts of things that Brandeis was talking about in terms of bounded rationality have been shown up, have been revealed by the financial crisis. I think Brandeis would not have been surprised to discover all those bank executives who had no idea what was being traded under the names of their derivatives. It's simply not possible. They have to hire, how shall I say, they have to hire PhDs in physics to figure out what it is that's being traded. And I think that's in large part due to the collectivization of banking and the collectivization of risk in this way. But I take your point, I agree with it.
Can I respond to Betsy's excellent questions,
Let's
which I think
go for
relate
it.
to them,
Yeah.
relate to each other very well? So the curse of bigness and income inequality. Brandeis is absolutely concerned with questions like regularity of employment. He thought it was very unfair that workers could work for 6 months and then be laid off for 3 months and be unable to care for their families and then have to pick up a job again. So he, in his wonderful savings bank reform, which he considered a perfect reform, insisted on regularity of employment as a way of guaranteeing that people could get a decent wage over the course of the year. And he's so fired up about this reform that he talks to Franklin Roosevelt about it right after he's inaugurated and wants to make this national reform as well. So he's intensely concerned about that. It is important, though, income inequality, I think it's important to stress one short-sighted aspect of Brandeis, which is that he's not a crusader for racial equality. He does not understand the implications of race and income inequality. He's not, unlike Woodrow Wilson, is not supporting federal segregation. He's neither more or less progressive on race than the other progressive justices of his era. But unlike women's suffrage, where he changed his mind, he had once opposed it, but came to support it because he'd worked with all these remarkable women in the women's suffrage movement and thinks that it's crucial to American democracy, not a crusader on race. I think this may be one explanation for why progressives today are less enamored of him as a hero, because this tradition of economic populism, Jefferson, Jackson, Franklin Roosevelt, Southern Hugo Black, Brandeis, these are Southern white men who are concerned about the effect of income inequality on small business people, but less concerned about the race and gender issues that the Democrats and progressives in the 1960s became much more focused on in an age of abundance. I think that that short-sightedness may help to explain some of his appeal. Unions, he's absolutely concerned about bigness in unions as well as bigness in government. So he supports the restrictions in the 1908 Tillman Act that restricted corporate as well as union spending in campaigns. Those restrictions were struck down in the Citizens United case, which, as Justice Ginsburg said here and in the book, he would have strongly opposed. At the same time, Brandeis writes a series of opinions, often in dissent, upholding the rights of secondary boycotts in the face of attempts to strike them down by Chief Justice Taft, for whom this was a crusade ever since he was on the lower court. Taft really doesn't like unions and is trying to defend property rights. Brandeis says, he has so many quotations, but in the duplex printing case, he says, when centralization and the control of business brought its corresponding centralization in the organization of working men, new facts had to be appraised. So he's very much supporting that. And your final spectacular question, which I was so eager to answer, I've now misplaced. Remind me what it was, because I'm
The last question
I got
is
the
about
answer.
the bipartisan vision
Okay,
for our
right, of course.
polarized age.
So the national plug alert, because I've got two crusades in life. One is Louis Brandeis, and the other is the National Constitution Center, which I have the privilege to head. And Brandeis would have been very excited about the Constitution Center. All of us, whenever I have a hard question, I ask WWBD, what would Brandeis do? And of course, I always think, as Richie does, we were laughing at lunch, of course he would agree with me. So I'm convinced that Brandeis would have loved the National Constitution Center, which has a mandate from Congress, even though it's a private nonprofit, and he would have liked that mix of public and private, to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. This is the one place in America that has a congressional charter to do what Brandeis envisioned, which is to bring all sides together for constitutional debate and education. And I'm going to give you examples of this, but we're doing this online with this remarkable online constitution co-hosted by the Federalist Society, the leading conservative lawyers organization in America, and the American Constitution Society, the leading liberal group, where liberal and conservative scholars are writing about every clause of the Constitution, describing what they agree about and what they disagree about. The College Board is making a centerpiece of the new AP exams, but this interactive constitution, and our podcasts are getting 400,000 downloads a week, which unite these liberal and conservative scholars. But I'm sharing this not to plug this great organization, although I'm also doing that, but because on each of these podcasts and on the interactive constitution, when you bring people together for civil face-to-face debate, this is the crucial thing, and Brandeis understood this. In his beautiful Whitney concurrence, he talked about if there be time enough for deliberation, then you have to allow reasoned discourse because only an emergency can justify repression. He thought, I'm not sure I agree with Richie that he would have been despondent about America because he was so optimistic always about the ability of people to develop their faculties and if brought together in face-to-face communication to deliberate. So just to give one example and then I'll stop. On the interactive constitution, you see the leading conservative and liberal scholars in America agreeing about the unconstitutionality of NSA surveillance, citing the general warrants, which Brandeis invoked in his Olmstead dissent, and citing Brandeis's Olmstead dissent itself. And we now have a visiting scholars program where Senators Chris Coons and Mike Lee, Democrat of Delaware and Republican of Utah, are going to join together for constitutional debates. They have also joined together about questions like NSA surveillance. The point is that face-to-face deliberation, both sides, and you tell people we're not having political debates, we're having constitutional debates. And Brandeis always insisted on the distinction between policy views and constitutional views. That's why he was so restrained and generally deferred to state legislature, except when the Constitution explicitly prohibited something. So I think those two criteria show that even today in this terribly polarized age, which we can see on television every night, is one where, given Brandeisian conditions for civil discourse, people can rise to the occasion, and that's why I think he would have been ultimately optimistic about American democracy.
That's great. And thanks for mentioning the NSA. And Olmsted gives me a chance to plug that 2 weeks from today in the same room, we'll be taking up those issues in more depth. But in the meantime, bigness and inequality, autonomous labor, what do you want to comment on, Alexis, Richie?
Oh, I wanted to jump in on the last question also, this idea of opposing bigness and bipartisan vision. I wouldn't say that I'm entirely optimistic, but there are some signs where this has happened. I was talking over lunch about two people that could not be more different. Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator David Vitter came together to do essentially like an absolute size limit on banks. And then that same Republican, David Vitter, partnered with Senator Elizabeth Warren about, I don't believe I mentioned this, but over and above the $700 billion in TARP bailout money, the Federal Reserve gave, at its peak, $1 trillion in emergency assistance to banks, to car companies, to foreign banks during the heat of the financial crisis. The only reason we know about it is because Bloomberg FOIA'd them and then sued the Fed in court. And then a big Wall Street lobby group joined the Fed to, try to make sure that Bloomberg never got this information. They eventually prevailed. And so now we know about all this emergency lending. So Senator Warren and Senator Vitter came together to try to improve the limits on that kind of emergency lending. Dodd-Frank did a little bit. They wanted to do a little more. So we do see pockets, I would say, of sort of bipartisan support for trying to tackle bigness. And something that I think came up in the presidential debate, the Export-Import Bank. Lots of Republicans oppose the Export-Import Bank because they see it as crony capitalism. It's essentially a big giveaway to companies like Boeing. And there are a handful of progressive Democrats that also oppose that. So those are a few places where I've seen that happening.
Great. Richie, before you weigh in, I want to invite students in the audience. If you want to line up, students are going to have priority for questions. There's a microphone over there. I'm sure those students who have been studying Louis Brandeis this semester or the Supreme Court are primed with lots of good questions. So just start lining up. In the meantime, Richie, why don't you take on?
I just have a couple of things to say in response to Betsy. First, about bigness and inequality. This is a big question. One thing I think that history has demonstrated in the 150 years between the Civil War and now, more or less, is that the more deregulated markets are, or the less regulated markets are, the more wealth they will produce and the more unequally they will distribute the wealth. And I think that there are many complex reasons for this, but I think they're tied in with bigness in the sense that two things. One, as I suggested earlier, and Alexis caught me on, in many economic environments, large-scale organization is required to take advantage of the technology and to produce all of the wealth. Fair enough. This means that very large numbers of people, thousands of people, will be employed in hierarchies rather than in markets at arm's length. And it also means that enormous amounts of money are going to flow through this non-market institution with small numbers of people at the top able to pinch it off as they wish. This is why in 2016, corporate executives can earn $40 million a year. And I think this contributes enormously to inequality. Two more very brief things. Alexis referred to insecurity in markets, and this is an important thing. When I sit with other economists and I talk to them about what Brandeis thought and about decentralizing and breaking things up, I try to emphasize Brandeis's idea that the point of decentralizing is to produce better human beings, more responsible, more resourceful, more self-reliant, Jeffersonian kinds of human beings. And people will frequently say, well, that would be great, And perhaps there are 40% of the population who would like to live a life like that, and another 60% of the population who just like to go to work every day, have a relatively secure wage in a big company that they don't think is going to go belly up in the next 20 minutes, the way that small firms frequently do, and that this is a problem for Brandeis's vision, that it may not be possible to stir people to want to be the kind of Brandeisian citizens that he and Jefferson hoped, and that large-scale organization is extraordinarily tempting to people who don't want to take on the responsibilities of entrepreneurship. You asked about contract labor. He'd love it, and he'd wonder whether Uber was going to merge with Lyft and they were just going to start to get bigger and bigger. But I think that the problem, not a problem, but the issue with contract labor is just the one that I've mentioned. It can't be a very secure way to live to be an Uber driver. And if an Uber driver is offered $60,000 a year to be a cab driver for Yellow Cab, the temptation is enormous, and Brandeis will whisper in his ear and say, don't do it, but a lot of people will. Finally, as everybody's been suggesting, you asked who's there today. Well, he isn't anymore, but he's still alive. He's my hero. He's the greatest living Brandeisian, and he is a fellow nutmegger. He's Ralph Nader, and we all had a chance to vote for him for President of the United States. My wife is still angry at me for voting for Ralph Nader for President of the United States. But here's an interesting thing. When Ralph Nader was prominent, and I'm now going back to the 60s and 70s, when I was in law school and was introduced to Louis Brandeis, my first thought was, aha, there was a Ralph Nader back then too. Well, I think that Ralph Nader, more than any other American, represents Brandeis in the modern era. What did he get, 16 votes in the last election? This is a problem. I think I don't think if Ralph Nader were here that he would recognize the allusion to Brandeis in the way that I'm making it. But I think that the fate of Ralph Nader's politics, the fate of his candidacy, suggests how far America has moved from the ideals of Jefferson, despite the best efforts of people like Brandeis to slow the train in the direction that it's been going.
I do feel like I should just make a plug for a member of Americans for Financial Reforms Coalition. Nader helped found Public Citizen, which does advocacy day in and day out, every day, and has a great grassroots network of people that are fighting all manner of things against climate change and corporate power. So.
Terrific. So we'll open now for some questions. This group has shown its great ability to multitask and take on a couple of questions at once. So I'm going to suggest that we hear from the first three students. We all have our pen and paper, so we'll keep a little track as they come, and then we'll kind of divide up the answers as we move forward. Please, and identify yourself as you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Sam. Thank you so much for coming to speak. It's been a really interesting discussion. My question is focused on the Dodd-Frank and more of the economy aspect of the discussion. One of the common critiques of Dodd-Frank is that the regulation that it's imposed on banks has caused a lot of local and community banks to either close down or they've been bought and through M&As through larger banks. And 2015 was one of the largest years for the M&A industry in the banking industry and in others. And so I wanted to ask about the validity of that claim about whether Dodd-Frank is actually responsible for those small and local banks closing down, and how would how do you think Brandeis would reconcile the contradiction of burdensome regulation being a cause for smaller local industries closing down, and making it easier for larger industries that already exist to acquire the local industries or become more dominant in that field?
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Josh. I'm a senior, and thank you guys all so much for coming. It's been a wonderful panel. As we've been talking about Brandeis's views on big corporation and bigness, I've been wondering about how he would have viewed big corporations becoming media today and kind of the move from small local papers that I think he probably would have really enjoyed to big companies that are mass producing media like Fox and CNN and NBC kind of dominating our interpretation and views of the world.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Noah. I'm a senior as well. My question's kind of about sort of Brandeis and government, because I think it's very related to this question of Bigness and how he sees government interacting with that rule of business. You talked a bit about how he opposed big business as well, but he did support the creation of the Fed, and was one of an early advocate for the FTC, and he's has a lot of work that's sort of behind sort of things that definitely seem to be supporting having some kind of a regulation, if not an active sort of cop on the beat way, as we might say today. Do you think that there's, how did he see government in regulating that?
Great. So 3 questions: Dodd-Frank and the effect on small banks, the question of growing media enterprises, and was Brandeis a little more of a regulator than we might have given him credit for here? You want to start, Jeff?
Media and briefly regulation. He would have been deeply interested in and concerned by those are all great questions, by the way, thank you for them, by the trends toward media consolidation. And I think he would have really focused on questions like net neutrality, because the net neutrality debate posits the possibility that media monoliths like Comcast might favor its own content over those of its competitors. So the example is the user who tries to download videos of barbershop quartets over a file sharing service, but can't because Comcast has blocked this service because it's allegedly favoring its own. So net neutrality says that media monoliths are not allowed to favor or privilege their own content, but have to treat all content equally. And Brandeis would have affirmatively supported that, not only as a check on bigness and monopoly, but also as a guarantee of free speech. He would have understood the connections between bigness and free expression in a really profound way and supported it greatly. As the economics of media and the difficulty of getting paid for journalism, I speak as a journalist who started off at an age when you could get paid, I think the broad question of what he would have made of the net and whether is deep and complicated. On the one hand, it represents the apotheosis of his hopes that informed, engaged citizens can participate, and everyone with a cell phone is now a journalist and is able to, engage online. On the other hand, he would have lamented the polarization of discourse into electronic mobs and communities of interest that represented the kind of gossip that he didn't like. So I think that was a mixed bag for him. Briefly, on the question about the FTC and the Fed, he absolutely was central in both of those reforms. But both, interestingly, are uniquely Brandeisian. The Fed is a decentralized institution. It's been criticized today for being inefficient because it has this complicated combination of appointment by the state banks and centralized control. I can't even describe it. My colleagues can do it better. But that was because Brandeis didn't want a Teddy Roosevelt-style Bureau of Corporations that would have regulated all banks. He wanted to mix federal and state things. And that's why the FTC today has been criticized for its lack of enforcement power. That was another Brandeisian caution. So he was a regulator, but a cautious one. His motto, and he said this over and over again, is regulation of monopolies as opposed to regulated bodies, and he favors what he called regulated competition is his idea. So it's a mixed bag.
Alexis.
I'd love to respond to the community banks point. This is a lobbying talking point that comes up a lot, but most of Dodd-Frank actually, community banks are not subject to. The CFPB, you have to be a very, very large bank, over $10 billion, before you're even subject to the regulation. It is true that there has been a decline in the number of community banks, but that is a multi-decade long trend that predates Dodd-Frank. And actually, after Dodd-Frank, the rules that they are subject to, things around called qualified mortgages, which has to do with making sure that a bank gives you a mortgage that you have the ability to repay. We've actually seen profitability in community banks higher than larger banks, and they've gotten more deposits than the larger banks have, just in terms of percentage, right, not in terms of absolute numbers. And then you also have rules like the Volcker Rule, where smaller banks have reduced reporting requirements, and most of them don't do the kinds of activity that the Volcker Rule prohibits, which is basically gambling with risky products. So we do hear that a lot, but it's usually deployed by the big banks who are locking arms with the community banks to push for reforms. I actually wrote a piece about this, about how the larger banks use community banks as a sort of human shield. And the head of the Independent Community Bankers Association, a guy named Can Fine, actually, this was on Medium. I don't know if any of you use Medium. He liked the post and shared it. So I think that would be my response to the question about community banks.
And Richie, before you answer, if others can join the line, and non-students now can take their place if they wish in the question line.
People in zone 3.
People in zone 3.
I just wanted to make a brief comment to the last questioner who was asking about regulation. I read a review of Philip Estrom's biography of Brandeis many years ago, and the reviewer referred to Brandeis as an intense libertarian. I thought this was interesting. I think of myself as a libertarian, but I disagree with almost every libertarian I know, and so I call myself a left libertarian to distinguish myself from what I perceive to be naive right libertarians. And here's the distinction, and I'll get back to Brandeis in just a moment. Modern American libertarians hate government and distrust government. So if you tell an American libertarian, what are you for? He'll say, break up the state. He hates the state. And Brandeis didn't. I don't hate the state, but I'm a libertarian. I learned this from Brandeis. Brandeis wanted to use the state so as to advance his goals for individuals. It's a mistake to think of Brandeis as a libertarian. It's correct, I think, to think of him as an individualist in the sense that Jefferson was an individualist. Brandeis was primarily concerned with the moral, intellectual, spiritual development of individuals. He felt that the great developer, as he put it, was responsibility, and thus responsibility for business, responsibility for oneself should always devolve to the individual. That's Jefferson's position as well. What distinguishes Brandeis from Jefferson is that Brandeis lived 125 years later and saw the value of the state in promoting the ideal of the individual. And I think this is the strongest part of Brandeis is this ability to see the state as the friend of individuals, that it's possible to use the state for individualistic ends. We don't see anybody, again, but Ralph back in the day, who is speaking this position. We see people on the Tea Party who want to atomize, that's Holmes's word, to vaporize government, which is stupid. And then we see people who just want to regulate like crazy, which is also silly since it doesn't work very well. But it is quite possible to use government to break up big banks, to break up big companies, to set limits on things so that individuals can thrive. And this seems to be a position in American politics now with no advocates.
Great. So I think we'll have time for one more cluster of questions, and it looks like we've got exactly 3 people ready to ask them.
Okay. Thank you all for speaking tonight. I feel like I learned a great deal about Justice Brandeis. My question is this, kind of in response to what Mr. Adelstein said about climate change. So, upon realizing the severity of the climate crisis and the horribly unsustainable course on which it is taking humanity today, if Justice Brandeis were alive today to see this and how the climate crisis is happening and how the fossil fuel industry is committing severe social justice violations against working class communities and communities of color who face the brunt of pollution from fossil fuel infrastructure, how would he feel that the institution bearing his name remains deeply invested in the fossil fuel industry? And what might his advice be to the Brandeis University Board of Trustees on how to combat this very unsustainable course for humanity that this university remains deeply complicit in to this day?
Okay, great.
Kind of along
those lines a bit. Back to inequality. How do we take these economically progressive ideals from Brandeis and translate them into social change and uplift of the most marginalized groups today?
Hi. I just want to say thank you again. This has been a really interesting panel to witness. But so my question is kind of in relation to Yona's, but I was just interested how you're feeling. At what scale do you feel that the university should uphold Brandeis's legacy in his positions on big business? And in the case of our endowment and the investment in large and powerful corporations such as the fossil fuel industry, where does that duty lie in keeping it in check?
All right, so a series of questions about that bring the ideals of Justice Brandeis into the institution named after him, and perhaps by extension other similar institutions that are facing the same kinds of dilemmas today about what kinds of stands they should or shouldn't take in relation to climate change, social justice, and so forth. Thoughts?
I mean,
Betsy, you can weigh in on this too.
I have, it's hard for me to say how Brandeis would feel about Brandeis's climate change policies, but I would assume that he would think that Brandeis University should be more progressive than they are, although I think our panelists probably aren't very familiar with current efforts at the university to make changes, right? Which have been increasing of late.
But there is a sense about, I guess the extension of that question is what should institutions like this, that is those that are nonprofits and that have a commitment in some ways to the sort of notion of citizen education, spread of knowledge, the implementation of some of those citizen ideals, do they also have responsibilities to act in institutional ways that reflect those, or should politics be separated from that process?
Well, just one thing that comes to mind to me is I read a book, I believe by Steve Cole, about Exxon, and he talks about how Exxon is such a powerful company that they're a nation, a sovereign nation unto themselves. Like, they don't even consider themselves to be an American company. They consider themselves to be a sovereign power. And I can't think of a better example of a corporation that probably needs to be broken up than one that considers itself to be their own country. And I certainly think that, I am coming at this from an outsider's perspective, but I've seen news reports about some of the divestment efforts at the university. I certainly commend the students that are waging it, and I think that, it's certainly an expression of an informed consumer that this is something that may risk my life or the life of my children, and I would like to think that Brandeis would be in favor of it. Obviously, I have no unique knowledge of what the reality is, but that would be my opinion.
Yeah, I have one other question that might help push this a little further and wrap things up. We've talked a lot about Brandeis's concerns about bigness, and one of the reasons that he, of course, has been concerned is that the effect on individual people. Of course, he wanted to create space for people to become as whole and engaged as citizens, but he was also concerned about the harms done in his own era. And I guess one of the questions I might have for you is where did he see issues of accountability? Who did he really hold responsible? Did he hold the individuals who were running these corporations responsible? Was it a more systemic critique? And how might he have responded to the critique that in the wake of the crisis of 2008, very few individuals have been held responsible for harms done to millions of people in this country and around the world?
Well, he certainly was in favor of individual responsibility, and the reason he got onto the Supreme Court may have been his role in the Pinchot-Ballinger affair, where essentially he's hired by the Senate to investigate charges that President Taft's Attorney General has whitewashed an investigation into a whistleblower in the Conservation Department. And through his incredible fact-based cross-examination, he shows that Taft has backdated the document and basically lied. The cover-up is worse than the crime. This splits the Republican Party, leads Pinchot to go side with Teddy Roosevelt, convinces Roosevelt to run as a third party, helps deny Taft re-election, and puts Brandeis on the court. So he was not opposed to good investigations. He was upset about the lack of individual accountability that systemic oligarchy created, and he gave examples about the fact that only George Perkins in Morgan's organization understood. Even Perkins didn't understand the complexity of the instruments that he was signing. So, but he wouldn't have left it at that. He was not, like Taft, focused on the law enforcement model of just prosecution. He saw the problems as systemic. That's why he wanted to regulate competition and break up these organizations before they occurred. He would have absolutely been concerned about the effects of a monopoly on communities. I try in the last chapter to channel him on Amazon and Walmart and what he would have made of a world like this. I think he would have supported things like the fixed price agreement that European countries have adopted to protect small booksellers. He might have even sided with Apple rather than the Justice Department in the suit that was trying to keep up the price of ebooks. He would have liked the German and Japanese laws that restrict the size of businesses, which makes it hard for Walmart to operate in those countries. So the effect of large mega stores on democratic deliberation in communities is one that would have really affected him. I have to end by, but is it individual, is it collective? Ultimately, I think Richie is absolutely right. This is an individualist who believes that the greatest remedy to our evils is the duty of self-education. He was just so keen on the need of all of us to use our leisure time. He takes the word leisure from the Greeks. Leisure means unemployment. That means hours away from employment where you can read Tolstoy and statistics and take your Kant to the beach and basically educate yourself into the kind of citizen who's fully able to participate in democracy. So it's an arduous notion of citizenship. This is not for passive consumers. He hated the phrase consumers. Yes, he believed in engaged citizens who used whatever, the flesh is weak and we are all, have our limitations, but you have to use your limited time and energy to read and think more, eat and drink less, and basically, like the Greeks who he idealized so much, basically make yourself worthy of the privilege of citizenship through education. That's why you guys are so lucky to be here at the university that bears his name, and he would have been so proud of this great university.
Richie, last comment?
About the divestment movement or this sort of thing. I don't know what he would have thought about this particular question, but I do think that he would have agreed, generally speaking, with a professor, an economist, and a political scientist named Charles E. Lindblom, who's a favorite of mine and who I think is, in many ways, a disciple of Brandeis. Lindblom had this wonderful idea that when we're making public policy, by which he could just easily have said when Brandeis University is making policy for itself, we don't have any idea what the right policy is. Nobody has any idea what the right policy is. And so Lindblom says the response that we should have is to decentralize responses to the problem. You should try to empower as many different people with as many different points of view on any particular problem, and then set them into competition with one another, fighting with one another to make policy. I think Brandeis, would have been terrifically attracted to this way of thinking about making policy as sort of the resultant of a parallelogram, as he would have put it, of forces. You got the divesting people here and the non-divesting people here and this people here and these people here, and at the end, after a lot of debate and toing and froing, they come to some sort of agreement, or somebody wins a majority and a policy is made, and it has the virtue not necessarily of being correct, but having won the agreement of enough people to have been adopted. And I think Brandeis would have been terrifically attracted to this way of thinking about making policy, because this is what devolves authority down to individuals. If individuals educate themselves, if individuals take the time and trouble to become active, even if they all oppose one another, the activity and the interaction of the active people will, for Lindblom and I think for Brandeis, ultimately produce a tolerable and possibly even a wise policy. So if Brandeis were here, I don't know what he'd say about divestment, but he'd certainly be very, very pleased to see that there are lots of people arguing for it, particularly young undergraduate people arguing for it. I suspect he'd be disappointed if there weren't anybody arguing against it. That is to say, I think he'd be distressed if there was a uniformity of thought in a community like this so that everybody was on the same side. So I think he'd have been thrilled with Occupy, not because he necessarily agreed with everything they wanted to do, but this is something that seriously empowers individuals. And I think that that's what Brandeis was about, without knowing before the fact what the right answers to the questions were. Open up the process of deciding to as many people as possible, and you're likely to get the best result.
Alexis, do you want to send us out with a final word?
Oh, well, in
No
listening,
pressure.
the thing that jumped to my mind was about using your leisure time well, and I guess I just want to put out a pitch. So the reason I got involved with Occupy was first curiosity, but then I got involved with this very nerdy book club, which was essentially a group of former Wall Streeters and lawyers that read this very long piece of regulation called the Volcker Rule, essentially like a book club. And we met twice a week, and we went line by line, and we put on our evil genius hat, and we said, how would we get around this regulation? And then we wrote this long letter. And it was incredibly rewarding, and there are so many avenues for you to do that. I mean, the law, any new regulation generally has a comment period where you can, as a member of the public, comment on it. So whether it's an environmental regulation or an economic one, it's something that I did that I really enjoyed. It was in my leisure time. It was not for any job. So just want to put in a plug for using your leisure time for something maybe a little bit nerdy.
Well, you have all contributed already previously, before today, through your outstanding writing on Louis Brandeis and his residence today. That we'll all be able to draw on. And now we'll also be able to draw on this conversation, not only those who heard it today, but those who will be able to watch it in the future, as we really try to continue the process here of the university of embodying that sense of citizen engagement that we've been talking about, that our university's namesake so encouraged. So please join me in thanking our terrific panel today.